Good morning. And welcome to the 10th annual Sacred Trust Talks and Book Signing event presented by the Gettysburg Foundation and Gettysburg National Military Park. The Gettysburg Foundation is the nonprofit partner of the National Park Service at Gettysburg. And I'm Cindy Small, Director of Marketing for the Gettysburg Foundation. Over the years, as we have presented this program, we've been so pleased to invite renowned Civil War authors and historians, National Park Service rangers, licensed battlefield guides, and others to share their unique perspectives on history, the Battle of Gettysburg, and the American Civil War. For our first topic of the day this morning, we are so excited and honored to have National Park Service historian John Heiser with us. John is going to present the Great Reunion of 1913. John began his career in the park in Virginia in 1976 at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Parks before moving to Gettysburg in 1980 as a seasonal park ranger. During his time here, John has served as in the Parks Division of Interpretation, in the Structures Preservation Shop, in the Division of Maintenance, and the Park Historian's Office. In his current position, John maintains the park's website, coordinates library services, spends countless hours and going to great detail to assist researchers, provides ranger-guided battlefield programs, and special Battle of Gettysburg anniversary programs and walks for visiting organizations, for Civil War roundtables, and for park visitors, and for the Sacred Trust program. Outside of John's Park Service career, he's probably best known for his sketches and for his incredible, detailed, unique, and original maps produced for numerous books on Gettysburg. Will you please join me in a warm Sacred Trust welcome for National Park Service historian John Heiser.
And good morning, everybody. Hope everybody's nice and cool here under the tent. This morning is a discussion about the Great Reunion of 1913, and I was struck last year as everyone was going gung-ho to celebrate and observe the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. It was also the centennial year of the Great Reunion of 1913, which to a lot of people really doesn't mean as much as the battle and campaign, but let's put it in the context of the time in which this great reunion of veterans here on the battlefield of Gettysburg occurred. And I have to admit that I have a soft spot in my heart, always have had a soft spot for veterans of war, any war, no matter whether it be World War II, World War III, Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, no matter what the conflict is, I always have a soft spot in my heart for veterans and what they've done in their service. And as a young kid, I remember one of the first books I looked at in elementary school was this state report about this great reunion of Union and Confederate veterans here on the Gettysburg battlefield in 1913. I was fascinated by it because it's not just full of data and details and stories, but it's also full of photographs of these aged men wandering arm in arm, hand in hand over the battlefield of Gettysburg. But let's think back to America at the turn of the century. America was going through a time of great change. It's after the Civil War, after the period of Reconstruction. There's a period there where America is growing in leaps and bounds. The Industrial Revolution, things are gradually changing. But there's nothing that has really united this country again. It takes a nice little war, which is the Spanish-American War, 1898. Nice little handy war, and what's unique about that is here is a conflict that everybody can bold themselves together against a common enemy. All of us remember what happened in 9/11. It's the same thing. America pulled itself together. And in that conflict, the Spanish-American War, you had former Confederate officers serving side by side with their former nemesis, former Union officers, in the same great cause. So America really has reunited itself. But in the decade afterward, under the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, America not just becomes a domestic power, it becomes an international power. One of the things Roosevelt does is his international influence is very unique. He's very protective of the American continent, but he also has great relations with foreign powers. And to show America's might, at one point he sends the American Navy around the world just to show what we're made of. America changes dramatically. And to give you a couple statistics, in that year period between 1900 and 1910, there are 76 million Americans living in 46 states. The U.S. Treasury has $46 million in it. There's 8,000 cars, 8,000 automobiles in the United States, but there's only 10 miles of paved road. In 1900, there are 96 auto deaths by automobile. The saddest statistic of that year, there are 115 lynchings, majority of them in the South, but a number also in the North, primarily of African American men or teenagers. The San Francisco earthquake also occurs during that period. 700 lives are lost, a cost of over $4 million in damage. The average worker makes $13 a week. That's for a 59-hour work week. So wages aren't real high for the blue-collar people of America. And the life expectancy for a female is about 47.5 years. For the males, it's only 46. One of the more interesting things, too, is women are now making themselves more known politically, socially. And it's during that period where the newspapers are headlined that a woman was actually smoking in public in New York City and was arrested by the police for doing so. So America's changing. Baseball is becoming the national sport. We're now advancing technologically with flight. Everything is changing. And in that atmosphere, politically, we're also changing. I'm very curious as to what happened in the election of 2012. There's a lot of parallels in that 100-year episode because in 1912, it was almost the same thing. The Republican Party was split in half, and what happened in the election was then gave way to Woodrow Wilson, moderate Democrat from Missouri, a lawyer, who then became President of the United States. Theodore Roosevelt was not happy with William Howard Taft, and the Bull Moose Party was born during that period, and what it did was divide the country politically, and so we had Woodrow Wilson. Wilson was a Southern Democrat, and the atmosphere now began to change because Congress itself was starting to fade of Civil War veterans. Less and less Civil War veterans were serving as congressmen, senators, and so the influence of veterans in Congress was gradually fading away. The commemoration of the American Civil War, the 50th anniversary, began in 1911 with small ceremonies on many southern battlefields. But no one really had the great idea of the commemoration or the observance of a battle until actually it began years before. A man named Henry Heidecopper, who served here at Gettysburg, Lieutenant Colonel of the 150th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry, and lost an arm here in action. He had an idea that Gettysburg was going to be the culmination of this great observance of the 50th anniversary of the Civil War. And not just an observance of the battle, but it's going to be a great reunion of Union and Confederate veterans. They're going to come back here, camp side by side on the great battlefield of Gettysburg as a symbol not just of what happened here in 1863, but also as a symbol of reunification, national reunification. Heidecopper goes to the senator or the Congress, or excuse me, the governor of Pennsylvania. They're very enthusiastic about it. Initially, Pennsylvania is going to bear the cost for this reunion. That's the idea. But as it grows, the planning grows, they realize Pennsylvania will not have the money to cover all of this. They will seek federal aid. And committees are set up in the state as well as federal committees in Congress and Washington to oversee the Great Reunion of 1913. This isn't the first mutual reunion at Gettysburg. In 1887, Pickett's Division Association, a small group of veterans, about 150, were invited to come to Gettysburg for a small reunion here by members of the Philadelphia Brigade Association. These two great groups had fought each other face-to-face, hand-to-hand on July 3rd, 1863. They came back here in 1887 for a small mutual reunion here on the battlefield. And this photograph you're seeing was taken at that time of the Union Confederate veterans shaking hands over the stone wall they fought over several years before. So it had happened before, and even though these two groups had pledged to meet again, and they did once or twice, a large mutual reunion had not ever been held again. They started planning for the anniversary right away, and some of the resolutions that were passed by the committees as they oversaw the planning for the reunion was that the veterans should be sponsored by the respective states. In other words, that each state would pay for its veterans train fare to come to Gettysburg. They would pay for their accommodations. It would also pay somewhat for the cost, logistics of housing them and putting them here. Appropriations for the transport and subsistence of Pennsylvania veterans was passed right away. In other words, the state was going to pay for all the train fare for everybody to come here. The government authorized also the erection of a peace memorial. This was the desire of the veterans of the GAR and the UCV, that somewhere on some battlefield a memorial should be placed as a symbol of reunification, peace eternal and a nation reunited. And that was authorized by Congress as early as 1910. The cornerstone was to be laid for this memorial on July 4th, 1913. Problem, of course, was money. Where was the money going to come from? That was set aside, at least they had the authorization to do so. The legislature of Pennsylvania approved an initial budget of $50,000 for the use of the state committee to then begin the initial meetings, get all the veteran representatives together, and things really started going. Pennsylvania Anniversary Commission was headed up by James Schoonmaker. He was a former colonel of the 14th Pennsylvania Cavalry. And this is his photograph here. The commission was responsible for coordinating all the state efforts as well as the federal efforts to get this reunion started and also to get the logistics completed. Also on the committee were a number of Gettysburg, I'd call celebrities. R. Bruce Ricketts, whose battery F&G 1st PA Light was on East Cemetery Hill on the evening of July 2nd, overrun by the 6th North Carolina, then later recaptured, along with Captain William J. Patterson of the 62nd Pennsylvania, who fought at the Peach Orchard on July 2nd. The Wheatfield was severely wounded, as well as Captain William E. Miller of the 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry, Medal of Honor winner here at Gettysburg. The U.S. Senatorial Committee, headed by George Oliver of Pennsylvania, sponsored the first cooperative meeting with the Pennsylvania Anniversary Commission of officials here at Gettysburg, October 13th to the 14th of 1910. And this is a photograph of the commissioners meeting here. All these men were representatives of each of the northern and southern states where the GAR and the UCV had national or statewide chapters. And most prominent amongst these representatives, you'll see right down in the front row, right in the center, bald-headed with the crutches across his lap, is Daniel E. Sickles, the last surviving Corps commander of the Army of the Potomac, for that matter, for either army that served here at Gettysburg. And Sickles not only would create the battlefield with his legislation in 1895, we also attend the 50th anniversary and commemoration of the battle and the Great Reunion. Along with him were a number of other celebrities, not all of them pictured here, General Lewis Grant, Felix Robertson, John Page Nicholson, who was the chief of the commission here at Gettysburg, William E. Miller, Medal of Honor winner, 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry, Evander Law. General Law was the man whose brigade attacked Little Round Top and fought so well in Slaughter Pen and Devil's Den, as well as Andrew Cowan. Andrew Cowan, some of you will know who are Gettysburg buffs, was the commander of the 1st New York Independent Battery, did such good service in the repulsive Pickett's Charge on July 3rd, 1863, and then saw distinguished service throughout the rest of the war. Things went pretty well for the most part in the planning, the initial idea of it, but the real crux of it came over the invitations, how it was going to be sent out to all the GAR and UCV posts, who was going to be invited to Gettysburg, and that was part of the maybe consternation in the very beginning. There's also quite a bit of friction in that initial meeting when the representative of the UCV stood up and talked about the cause of the war, how they're now forgotten, and how this silly thing over fighting over slavery really wasn't an issue. Well, that didn't go over very well with the commander of the GAR, who stood up and said, obviously the Confederate veteran did not fight the same war I fought in. But calmer heads took over, and they soothed some hard feelings there, and things actually got going because they thought there was a greater good, the idea of this great reunion here at Gettysburg. And in initial follow-up meetings of these committeemen in 1911, 1912, 1913, things were finally set in order and set in place for the Great Reunion of 1913. The big thing, of course, was the invitations and how the invitations were going to be sent out. Officially, they would not be sent out until April of 1913. But prior to that, they sent out, for lack of a term, feelers to all the UCV chapters in the south as well as the GR chapters and posts in the north how many veterans would like to come to Gettysburg. And one of the requirements was you should be a veteran of the Battle of Gettysburg. But then later on, that was tossed aside because so many people, so many veterans, even those of Western armies who had served in the Gulf, wanted to come to this great reunion. There was something special about this reunion, and so many of them wanted to come. But they really didn't know. The real issue here was, were any of the Confederate veterans willing to come to a site that had cost the South so much? This was the high water mark of the rebellion, the turning point of the American Civil War. And it was really Lieutenant General C. Irvin Walker, Commander-in-Chief of the United Confederate Veterans, who finally in 1912 passed out this word to all of the UCV posts throughout the South, saying, "We've been offered by the state of Pennsylvania and the United Veterans, the Union veterans, the hand of peace and amity with such cordiality, fairness, and consideration. They should know it and understand it, and we should accept and grasp it. Let us bury deep and forever all bitterness, but never fail to perpetuate the glorious history, that record of high duty superbly done by you in your young manhood." The invitations go out in April 1913, and each state has a quota. New York's quota, for example, is 10,000 veterans. But the problem is the overwhelming enthusiasm of the veterans wanting to come to this great reunion. New York's quota of 10,000 is met by the middle of April. By the 1st of May, they have 11,000 veterans signed up to come to Gettysburg, and there's an additional 500 on top of that whose applications are then being processed. New York will eventually send almost 16,000 veterans here to Gettysburg. Now, the accommodations for the veterans weren't supposed to be quite that big. Initially, they thought maybe 20,000, 25,000, maybe 30,000. And by May of 1913, the number had grown to 40,000 veterans, North and South, that were coming to Gettysburg. The enthusiasm was so overwhelming that they had to then try to expand the reunion more than just the 3 days of July 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and into the 4th, 1913. They initially then changed it June 30th to July 5th, but then contracted it again. We've got to try and control this. We'll put it back. Things start on June 30th, but it's July 1st, 2nd, 3rd, ends on the 4th. Everybody goes home. Everybody be happy. That's the idea. But eventually, almost 50,000 veterans will show up for this great reunion here at Gettysburg. The cost could not be borne completely by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and the federal government did step in with money appropriations as well as supplying troops and other support organizations here for the great reunion. The Pennsylvania National Guard would also cooperate and help with the reunion. Everybody had different duties. The United States Army and the Cavalry would guard the great camp where the veterans were housed. The Pennsylvania National Guard would take care of the Pennsylvania dignitaries. The state police would guard the roads and help with traffic control. Even though the veterans were encamped in what they call the Great Camp on the southwest side of Gettysburg, the other Union dignitaries from the north and the south would be camped in smaller camps at Gettysburg College as well as on the seminary grounds. There was also tents set up on East Cemetery Hill and what is today the National Cemetery Annex. It was a special camp for those who wanted to pay a little bit for a little bit of extra amenities. So it's huge. It's growing day by day, bit by bit. The Great Camp is pretty remarkable. Almost 48 or 4,500 tents, I believe, would be set up and used for the veterans. And the Great Camp was set up on the southwest side of town, was today the area called Colt Park, where the Gettysburg Recreation Park is. It was subdivided with Union Camp on one side, the Confederates on the other side. The Confederates actually were more along West Confederate Avenue. It was large enough to accommodate, ultimately, 50,000 veterans. This is the view of the Great Camp. If you look to the right in the background, you'll see Big Round Top and Little Round Top. And then to the left, as you go along the skyline, you'll see the tower that is in Ziegler's Grove. But this is a part of the Great Camp, the Confederate camp to the right. And as the panorama changes to the north, this is the main bulk of the Union camp. All the tents out there were the new Army squad tents that had been developed a couple years before, large enough to house 12 men. Now, for the reunion, 8 men would be assigned to a tent. Each man would have his own cot, blanket, pillow. He'd be issued his own utensils. Each tent was given 2 lanterns, as well as a wash basin and a bucket to bring water to the tent so the men could wash up. And the accommodations actually were very, very fine. A lot of these old veterans were pleased at this. A lot of them even, one man from New York even said how thrilled he was to be under canvas once again. Not since his Army days he'd ever been under canvas until now he was at the Great Reunion of 1913. And the camp's amenities were absolutely endless. As one veteran put it, the camp was a model in every respect. Well equipped, well cared for. At night, the grandeur and beauty of this camp was beyond description. Lighted by electricity, it presented a scene to those who saw it that will ever be remembered, one that the lapse of time will not from their memory soon efface. They had electric lights running through the camp, so at night it was lit up all night long. There was a quiet hours from 10 o'clock at night until 6 o'clock the next morning. There was plenty of water. Even throughout the camp, they had water fountains and faucets. Now, the unique thing about the bubbling water fountains, bubbling ice water fountains, this was a big feature of the Great Camp. There were about a dozen of them. And what they did was they dug ice pits, ran water lines through these ice pits, and as the water came out, it was ice water, bubbling ice water for these men. It's a really unique perspective. As far as the camp accommodations were concerned, each squad tent, enough to accommodate 12 men, with 8 veterans per tent. The latrines were constructed at the end of each street. There were also extra latrines established in town for the use of guests as well as other veterans who visited into town. As one veteran put it, these were really unique, clean, sanitary latrines. There was nothing that even approached an odor. Empty cans were burned, every place was disinfected daily, the garbage pans were removed daily before they even half filled. There was no litter and scarcely a fly was to be seen anywhere. Well, the days were very, very hot. No wonder the flies didn't come out. But to help with the meetings was the great tent. This is a view of one of the latrines that was in town, and there was constructed very temporary things, but some of the latrines had actually running water through them to take care of the sanitation needs. And I love this photograph of the veterans gathered around the wash basin outside their tent washing up in the morning. As one veteran put it, was like the busy beavers gathered around the little basin, everyone trying to wash their hands at the same time, but all laughing and having a great time with it, just like they had done 50 years before as boys in uniform. To accommodate the great meetings that they would have was this called the Great Tent. It was set up out there on the field of Pickett's Charge, one of the largest circus tents in the nation, big enough to accommodate 15,000 guests, as well as a platform, and they could also subdivide it during the day with large curtains, so they could cut off parts of it for meetings of state GAR and UCV meetings and things like that. So it was constantly busy in the great camp, or the great tent, throughout the day. The first veterans began to arrive in special trains on June 30th, and the trains would pull right into the center of the great camp, unload their charge, the men would get out, line up, they'd be marched off to their respective camp areas, Minnesota, New York, Pennsylvania. They all had their distinctive camp areas. The men would then be assigned to tents. They'd be issued their utensils, their blankets, their candles, their lanterns, and the Great Reunion began. And as one soldier put it, was just like being in the Army again. We'd get off the train, men are shouting, fall in, line up, and off we would march to the registrar. The GAR and the UCV were responsible for registering the men as they came into the camps. So it was just like the old days. You filled out the rosters, you came in, signed off, received your equipment, marched to your tent, and then the reunion began. It was really very festive in the beginning, because not only were it veterans coming in, but also the Army soldiers were there, the Boy Scouts were there helping with the veterans, and it was just this real festive attitude. As one soldier put it, it was just like the old days, just like the old days. And something about the spirit of these men permeated the Great Reunion. It wasn't just a grand meeting of old men, but the enthusiasm was building. As one soldier put it, it was just like a Methodist love feast. Union and Gray marched hand in hand, side by side, and they could not keep away from each other. They could not stay away from each other. One soldier, remember, there was a special train almost from every state. For example, Minnesota sponsored a special train for a number of its veterans to come here to Gettysburg, a number of whom had served in the 1st Minnesota Volunteer Infantry here at Gettysburg. The governor accompanied them, as did a lot of the other trains from Indiana, Ohio, Western Pennsylvania, New York, Vermont. All had special trains, usually accompanied by the governor and his staff, who then arrived here at Gettysburg, unloaded in the great camp or unloaded in town, marched to the great camp, and the reunion began. And what was probably most remarkable to a lot of these men was the size and scope of the great camp, built to accommodate 50,000 veterans, especially swelled to accommodate over 54,000 veterans. The Pennsylvania Department of the GAR held a reunion of their own in the great camp from June 26th to June 28th. They've been doing this semi-annually on the Gettysburg battlefield for a number of years. Well, a lot of the veterans from that encampment were supposed to go home. A couple thousand decided they'd stay over. They didn't want to hang. Hey, this is too important to go home. I'm having too much fun. So some of them did not go home. And I'm reminded, too, of the enthusiasm of some of these men to come here. Everybody will probably remember the story last month of the veteran in England who left his assisted living home. He went out every day, came back. He did not get in the group that was going to go over to Normandy to commemorate the 70th anniversary. And one day he just decided to go for a walk, left, and never came back. Well, they found him 2 days later in Normandy. The same thing happened for the Great Reunion in 1913. There's a number of instances, one I'm very familiar with, that occurred, a family living over near on the other side of Lancaster. An elderly veteran lived with a son and daughter. They said he was too old to go to the reunion. He did not have train fare. He's going to stay home. He insisted he was going to go home, so what they did, they locked him in his upstairs bedroom. The next morning, they get up, serve him breakfast, open the door, he's not there. Here he had climbed out the window, down a trellis, threw his bag on the ground, and wound up here at the Great Reunion. They actually sent out a police order to have him come back. But that's something about the spirit of these old soldiers. They had to come back to Gettysburg for one more time. R.L. Drummond, and this is a photograph of him taken actually in the 1870s, was here at Gettysburg, and he leaves a beautiful account of his experiences here and what he saw. And some of his words are right here about the great encampment, but he also adds, 50 years ago, the men came suddenly and unexpectedly upon this same town lying amongst the hills of Pennsylvania in the pride and the strength of their young manhood, fired by a lofty patriotism, nearly 200,000 men. They fought under great leadership for high stakes and to establish what both sides believed to be great principles. 50 years ago, they came as men of war. Now they come as men of peace. They come in the interests of a reunited country under one flag, by special invitation of the state of Pennsylvania, as friends and brothers, meeting upon one common ground in the cause of one common humanity. And that spirit pervades the camp for the next couple of days during the Great Reunion. What's really remarkable to me is how all these old men show up. The health department is really concerned about their health because these are hot days in July of 1913, just like they are in 2014. And these are elderly men. Average age is about 72 to 73 years old. The health department is really concerned, not just because of these men being out in the heat and exhaustion, they're also concerned because the taverns in Gettysburg are doing a booming business, right, from June 30th all the way through July 4th. And there's more than one incident of veterans who've had a couple on the cuff wandering around the streets of Gettysburg a little tipsy, being then escorted by either soldiers or state police back to their camps, at least sober up for a little bit. But they were concerned about these health issues, especially with the taverns in town, who were indeed doing a booming business. But the veterans, I always think about how they fed all these men. And these are two of my favorite photographs from the 1913 anniversary. Each company street had its own mess hall. So the men would line up for meals 3 times a day. And folks, they didn't give them Pop-Tarts. They gave them really good meals. In the morning, it was bacon and eggs, fresh bread with butter, hot coffee. Throughout the day, if they wanted coffee, tea, lemonade, they could go to that mess tent at any time during the day and get it. And the afternoon meal was also very substantial, usually beefsteak, mashed potatoes, vegetables, fresh bread again, coffee, tea, cold ice water, whatever they wanted. The evening meal was very substantial, basically the same way. And I always like this one photograph over to the right. The regular infantry often ate with the veterans. I love this fellow sitting there carving up his meal while his pet dog watches him very curiously. If you're a dog owner like me, you know what that feeling is like. There's very little conflict, though, during the initial days of the reunion. It seemed like the only real conflict for these men was the display of the Confederate flag. And when Governor Mann of Virginia arrived in the Confederate camp on the morning of July 1st, suddenly there were a number of large Confederate battle flags that appeared out of the Confederate side of the camp. A few of the Union veterans didn't like that flag. That's what they had fought against. They didn't really care about the color of the man's uniform or where the man was from or what his purpose was, but that flag was to them a flag of treason. And a number of them were very concerned about the display of that flag. Well, cooler heads once again took charge, calmed these men down, and throughout the rest of the reunion, a number of Confederate flags appeared, but it was almost like a mutual thing, a mutual understanding that the flag represented that lost cause, the thing that these men had fought for, the banner they had fought under, and really wasn't a matter of a political thing for the rest of the reunion, which was very good. And I think that's one thing that also made this great reunion so successful. As far as the veterans intermingling with each other, they couldn't keep them away from each other. And some of the best photographs were taken in town as the veterans, after their morning meal, they go into town, they meet up with each other, shake hands for the cameras, and the press was there everywhere. There were movie cameras, all the press was there from many northern and southern newspapers taking photographs just like this one. And the men just loved having their photographs taken. These old soldiers is some of the best attention they've had since they came home in 1865. One of the other attractions downtown, unfortunately, too, was many of the bars and saloons that would stay open from 9 o'clock in the morning serving liquor until midnight. Eventually, the health department did intervene and have some of these camps, places at least shut down by 10 o'clock and no longer serve alcohol to anybody who appeared to be inebriated. It wasn't just the veterans who were having their cuff, too. It was a number of visitors who came to town who also liked to drink and celebrate. I think sometimes they were a bigger problem for the state police and the borough police than the veterans themselves were. Among distinguished guests there, of course, was Daniel Edgar Sickles, who was part of this planning for the Great Reunion from the representative from New York. Daniel Sickles now is 93 years old, elderly, suffering from diabetes and a number of other ailments. For lack of a better term, he's very lethargic during the hot days there, and he comes with his little contingent of nurses and supporters. He's headquarters at the Rogers House, which no longer stands on the Emmitsburg Road. But a man who went by and saw the general wrote this account, how kind of sad it was to see this old man sitting on the front porch trying to stay cool, and I want to read you a part of it. At the headquarters of General Carr's brigade, I found General Sickles, a remarkable man for many things besides being the sole corps commander living on either side. He's 93 years old. To look at him, a wreck mentally and physically, to say nothing of failures connected with either phase. As I saw him, he was a pitiful object, sitting on the porch in plain view of where he directed the movements of his 3rd Corps on that memorable 2nd of July, 1863, where he also fell badly maimed from his horse. Among a host of others, I shook hands with him, but with reservations, the greetings being more like that of a corpse. So helpless he seemed as he lay back in his Morris chair, trying to smoke. He had quite a suite of 4 with him, trained nurses and their aides. One of the nurses was fanning him while the other was trying to light his cigar, and all he said as he shook one hand after the other was in a mumbling, low voice, "Tomorrow, 5 o'clock," alluding to a reunion of the blue and gray he was to attend. Poor old General Sickles. I pitied him as he lay back in his chair in the dooryard. A curious throng constantly on the stare about him, a passerby from his old command coming through it now and then to shake his limp, passive hand and listen to the mumbling words from the heat-oppressed, weary man, whose attendants were doing all they could to make him comfortable. But for the general, it was probably one of the most memorable high moments of his entire career. Here he is back at the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, being recognized not just by men of his old command, but by his former foe. He's the last Corps commander of the Civil War, 93 years old, lagging superfluous on the stage and none so poor to do him quite reverence he deserves. There's a great photograph of the general surrounded by some men of his old command, all cheering as best he could at that age, suffering and failing health, and General Sickles would indeed pass away the following year, 1914. Some of the other noted officials that we hear, I have to point out General Hunter Liggett. General Liggett was an Army veteran, had served during the Spanish-American War in command of troops. In the regular Army, he had risen to the rank of Brigadier General, and he was placed in command of the Army contingent here at Gettysburg. And what's notable about General Liggett was he was a national war hero. His name is kind of forgotten today, But as a leader of men during the Spanish-American War, he was highly recognized for his ability in leading volunteer troops. General Liggett, though, had an awkward way of getting into the camp. He arrived very late on the evening of June 30th and was stopped outside the camp by a sentry, Army sentry, his own man he was commanding, who had to stop him and say, "General, you cannot take your car into the camp. We're under strict orders not to allow vehicles in the camp to disturb the slumber of the veterans." So General Liggett picked up his bag and meekly walked to his headquarters tent in the camp all by himself. That's his arrival. But he commanded the Army contingent that was here. Among the Army contingent, by the way, was a young lieutenant named George S. Patton. Some of you will probably recognize that name. Patton was attached to the 15th United States Cavalry, and unfortunately, the future general didn't think very highly of the Civil War veterans who he met here at Gettysburg, just called them a bunch of boring old men. Ooh. Next to General Liggett, though, is Secretary of War Lindy Garrison. He was a New Jersey lawyer born in 1864. He was one of the enthusiastic men in the War Department who saw change coming in the Army. Also was very enthusiastic about this great reunion and used War Department funds to help fund it by not just getting the regular troops here, but adding money to the logistics, the food, the tenting, the supply, the setup of the great camp here at Gettysburg in 1913. Garrison, though, unfortunately would be at odds with his new president, Wilson, and eventually would have to resign from service and resign and leave the government. But this was Garrison's great moment here at the Great Reunion in 1913. And then standing to the right of them, excuse me, the left of them, is General Leonard Wood, whose main name will probably be familiar to some of you. Rough Rider. Also, Vice President Thomas Marshall arrived. Vice President Marshall, Democratic governor of Indiana, and was a very jovial fellow. Always had a good humor about him, always had a good sense of humor, had served in Congress for many years, and then became vice president. Unfortunately, he was the counter to the very stoic, very straightforward Wilson, and at times the two were very much at odds. Eventually, what happened with the vice president is he would come to work one day. His office at the time was at the White House. He came to work one day to find his office completely moved out of the White House across the street. That's how bad it was. But what happened with Wilson, what happened with Marshall, I always remember this, is there was a debate in Congress one day. A senator was talking about all the things that America needed, had an entire list of things of what America needed. And what Marshall said was, what this country really needs is a good 5-cent cigar. He's the one who coined the phrase. But Marshall was the perfect person to come here to address the veterans. And July 1st, the events opened. This was Veterans Day, considered Veterans Day. Governor Tenner of Pennsylvania opened the ceremony by rising to speak to the veterans. There were 15,000 gathered in the great tent, and he was suddenly interrupted by General Bennett Young, who was the commander of the UCV. He said, "I want to welcome all of you and thank our hosts of Pennsylvania by having my veterans in the audience give the rebel yell." And Miss Lucy Lee McGill, who was the granddaughter of General A.P. Hill, stood up and led them in this rousing rebel yell. You can imagine all these old veterans, woohoo, 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 echoing through the great tent. And over in the great camp, it was picked up. The men heard it. Those who had not gotten into the great tent heard the rebel yell, and they also picked it up, and it echoed throughout the great camp, welcomed them all to the great event there on July 1st, 1913. As General Bennett later spoke, he welcomes these guests, thanks them very much, and also talks about the cause for which they fought, the good fight, the duty which they'd served. And then to the Union veterans, he says, "I know better. You inaugurated this great reunion movement. We men of the South only had to come for it. You did not ask us to come with apologies or regrets for what we have done. If any Confederate veteran comes here with regrets on his lips, his uniform should be stripped from him. We come here with unshaken faith in our cause. We not come here any other way, and you do not want us here in any other way. We did our darndest, and angels could do no more." The rest of the events go on that day. It was very high feeling, a lot of veterans wandering around the battlefield, and that night there's a parade of Union veterans, impromptu, that leave the Union camp and march right up into the Confederate camp to welcome them to Gettysburg. And at one point, it was really interesting, one point, the parade kind of gets stopped right between the Mississippi and the Georgia contingent, And naturally, these Confederate veterans come out to shake the hands of the Union veterans, and they're shaking hands back and forth. And this one Confederate says, "God bless you, Yank. Here's to a long life for both of us." And the Yank, who is a man from Michigan, shouts back, "God bless you, Johnny. God bless you. Thank you. Good long life to you. And it's such a pleasure to be here, not to have to shoot at you." There's this air of friendliness that now pervades for the rest of the reunion. That night, there's a concert by the Pennsylvania National Guard. The music waves through the camp, and the camp closes down about 10 o'clock, and everyone goes to bed, getting ready for the next day, July 2nd, which indeed is the hottest day of the reunion. The temperature will top out at about 98 degrees that day. It's a very hot, humid day in Gettysburg, and the veterans will really kind of struggle to get through that day. Fortunately, that afternoon, there was a storm that will waffle through the camp, cool things down, and for the rest of the evening into the evening hours is a very, very pleasant reunion. Same for July 3rd. The only bad thing that happens that day, though, is something that occurs downtown in the Hotel Gettysburg. There's actually a brawl that breaks out. In the dining room that night, there's a man who's talking very badly about Lincoln at one table. A Union veteran from the 9th Pennsylvania Reserves takes exception to this, stands up, wraps the man in the head with his cane. The man pulls a knife, chases the veteran around the dining room. Men try to stop him. He knifes them. He cuts a waiter. He goes out in the street. He wrestles with two police. And here he is an attorney from Philadelphia, of all places, who claims to be the son of General J.J. Tazewell of Virginia. He is indeed the son of a Confederate veteran and does go to jail. He's bailed the next day by some of the Confederates, representatives there, and eventually plea bargains his way out of the assault. But that's the only really bad thing that happens downtown. But on the other hand, there's a really good thing that happens. That night, some Michigan veterans are in the great camp getting ready for bed, and they see an elderly Confederate veteran winding through the camp. They can tell he's lost. He's looking. He can't find his own tent. They take him into the tent that night, give up a cot to him. They take him into the tent that night. He sleeps throughout the night. The next morning, they escort him back over to the Confederate camp where his comrades find him. Again, that says something about the mutual respect and mutual things that are going on back and forth here at Gettysburg. But the big thing on July 3rd is not just the address by the Vice President, but it's also what occurs at the Great Angle, at the Bloody Angle on July 3rd that afternoon. It's the meeting of the Pickett's Division Association and as well as the Philadelphia Brigade Association. The gathering occurs that afternoon at about 2 o'clock. 180 members of Pickett's Division show up with 120 members of the Philadelphia Brigade Association. They stand side by side along the wall where they do eventually shake hands. But prior to that, it's a unique thing that happens. It's almost like a reenactment of Pickett's charge put on by 73-year-old men. Claude Leland from New York writes about this. "I sit there talking to 3 veterans of Hall's brigade. Up from the Emmitsburg Road comes a real column of Confederates. It doesn't look as the other column looked. Most of the men have canes, some crutches. There are empty sleeves by the dozen, but they come on up across the field with one of their battle flags, torn and riddled by the storm of 50 years before. The band at the head is playing Dixie. The wall is lined with people, and in a moment, someone shouts, 'Philadelphia Brigade, assemble here.' They crowd their way through the sightseers and finally manage to take their positions. Suddenly we all heard it, the rebel yell. Across the field it came, smiting our ears in piercing intensity, spine-tingling, blood-chilling cry. Slowly the line of old men advanced in good formation. They brandished canes and crutches. The more agile ones aided those less able to maintain their places. Nearer and nearer they came until they were close enough for us to distinguish their faces. Now they fell upon each other, Union and Confederate, Yankee and rebel, not in mortal combat, but reunited in brotherly love, affection, and emotion. Soldiers forgive. It's only civilians who cherish hatred throughout the years." The ceremony continues with an address by Congressman J. Hampton Moore of Pennsylvania, who talks about the valor that occurred here at Gettysburg between these two groups in 1913. And that, of course, is followed by the trading of flags between the two groups there at the angle. And this is a photograph of the Stars and Stripes being presented along with the Second Corps flag and a Confederate battle flag between the two groups. And also, it's an occasion for lots of photographs of veterans shaking hands. And this is probably one of the most famous photographs of Union Confederate veterans shaking hands over the stone wall there at the Bloody Angle on July 3rd, 1913. What I've since found out, though, is that the men on the right really are not representatives of Pickett's Division Association. They are indeed state representatives for UCV chapters throughout the South. The man in the very foreground was from Texas, was not at Gettysburg, but he was here as the state representative for the UCV here during the reunion. That night, the Confederate veterans hold their own parade to General Liggett's headquarters to thank him for their hosts for doing such a great job with the reunion, and the men all go home. But there's one more event to take place. Though President Wilson kind of blew off this reunion, he didn't really want to come here. He was under such political pressure to attend that eventually he consented. And about 3 weeks before the reunion, they changed the closing ceremonies to accommodate the president. He arrived in a special train, escorted by 2 veterans. They went to the great tent, where there was a moment of silence as the bugles sounded taps. And even in the great camp, the sound of cooking and the clinking of pots and pans stopped for at least a few minutes, and there was dead silence over the battlefield to close the ceremony. The president addressed the veterans who were there. The Army salute was over, and the great reunion officially ended at 1 p.m. Everyone then began the train ride home, and by July 5th, the great camp was empty. The last veterans leaving. By August 12th, the great camp exists no more. But the memories that come out of this, amid quieter scenes, we only have to look back at the many stories that came out of this reunion. I just want to relate a few to you. Some of the most remarkable are after 50 years, former foe will run into each other on the same battlefield as they're walking around telling the stories of their experiences here. And one particular occurrence occurs at the Angle on July 1st. George Nicholas, excuse me a second. Sorry, a man named A.C. Smith, 56th Virginia Volunteer Infantry, participated in Pickett's charge, was severely wounded in the Angle, where he was aided by a young Union soldier after it was over. The man gave him water and carried him to the rear out of the line of fire. And as Mr. Smith is talking to his comrades about what happened to him there, nearby is a small group of Union soldiers, Union veterans, standing around, and one particular individual, his arms behind his back, is listening to Mr. Smith tell his story. After it's over, he comes over and looks at him and says, "You know, I was here on July 3rd too. I saw a very young Confederate lying on the ground, his pale face looking up, pleading to heaven for help. I couldn't resist. I gave him water from my canteen. I picked him up on my back. I carried him over the ridge out of the line of fire." Smith looked at this man and said, "Oh my God, you are the man who saved me. You are the man who helped me." And the two embraced each other there on the battlefield. The Confederate veteran was A.C. Smith of the 56th Virginia. The Union veteran was Albert Hamilton of the 72nd Pennsylvania, meeting again there 50 years afterwards on the battlefield of Gettysburg. Likewise, there are other instances of this. In Devil's Den, a Confederate veteran was telling the story, Alabama veteran was telling the story about how he was fighting in the slaughter pen, how he was severely wounded, laying behind a boulder. His comrades left him there. And as the sun was beating down on him that afternoon, the bullets are bouncing off the rocks and hitting him again and again and again. He thinks, this is my final moments. When suddenly, over the boulder, appears a Union soldier who picks him up, carries him out of the line of fire to a better protected position, gives him a canteen of water, and leaves him there. As he tells this story, no more than 5 feet away is another group of Union veterans, and the man is telling the same story of seeing this young Confederate lying behind a boulder, giving his canteen, and leaving there and wondering, whatever happened to the man? The two look at each other and come together and look close in their eyes. They embrace, and the tears roll down their cheeks. There's so many stories like this that happen at Gettysburg, including stories of, "I think you're the fellow that shot me." "No, you're the fellow that saved me." But as the stories go back and forth, some of the best stories come out. There's one man named Hamilton who's leading this retracing Pickett's charge. He talks about, we were here, we were there, this is where we formed for the final charge, this is where we rallied to go over the stone wall. And one of the men who was accompanying him said, "Why don't you just be quiet? We all know you were in the hospital during this battle and weren't nowhere near Gettysburg." But the jovial men, blue and gray, that gathered together were really quite remarkable. The interaction was really incredible. As one soldier put it, Joseph Stone from Vermont, "I went to the rebels' camp and I found a jolly set of old boys as I'd ever met. We had a very great time. We told stories of wartime. 2 veterans took me around and showed me the position they had had, and even Captain Parker of Parker's artillery showed me the cannon that he had captured from our men, and the position along the stone wall of the cannon still stood. He also told me about the cannons being recaptured by our boys in the same position at the time of the fight." Robert Drummond also wrote about this. A friend of his who had been in Salisbury prison camp made friends with one of the Confederate prisoners of war, Confederate guards there. And at the end, when the camp was abandoned, the Confederate gave him a small diary to keep for him. He didn't think he was going to be able to keep it. 50 years later, this comrade of Drummond's comes back to the reunion, goes to the North Carolina camp with this thing. He knows that man's going to be here. But he's written him a letter. And the man responds, "I'm coming to the reunion. I'll meet you there." They go to the tent. The man has the diary. And unfortunately, the Confederate veteran died 3 weeks before the reunion. And as Drummond remarks, everybody was kind of shocked, but his comrade with the diary sat down and the tears rolled down his face over his former enemy's death, the man that he was never able to return that diary to, and everybody around him completely understood of what happened, completely understood the loss of comradeship between former enemies. One of the more remarkable stories, though, was about the flag of the 20th North Carolina. The flag was captured here at Gettysburg on July 1st by the 97th New York. And during the withdrawal to Cemetery Hill, the man carrying the flag was confronted by a Confederate soldier who then tried to grab the flag back. And they're wrestling over the flag. The Union soldier grabs one end of the flag, rips it completely in half, takes part of the flag with him, sticks it in his coat, and runs all the way to Cemetery Hill. And the Confederates left handling the flag staff and the other part of the flag. 1913, on July 1st, a small contingent of veterans from 97th New York go to the North Carolina camp with this half of the flag of the 20th North Carolina to present to the veterans there. And remarkably, the former color bearer of the 20th North Carolina, the same man from who the color was taken on July 1st as he lay wounded in the field out there at the Forney farm, is there to accept this relic of the Battle of Gettysburg, and the flag then returns to North Carolina. Whatever happened to that flag, no one seems to know, unfortunately. What counts, Gettysburg is not just a reunion of old soldiers too, it's also very much of a family affair. We think at least 200 sets of brothers attended the Great Reunion here. And what's interesting too is there were a number of sets I found. One was Union and one was Confederate. And in one case, I believe one case, they had not seen each other for 50 years. Families were so divided by the war, but here they met at Gettysburg in this Great Reunion in 1913. And this is a good example of family members who served not only in the Army of Northern Virginia, but had not seen each other until they came here to Gettysburg for the Great Reunion of 1913. The blue and gray gathered together, hand in hand, arm in arm, and after the reunion over, the feeling of mutual respect and unity was, you couldn't describe it. Even the men who went home and tried to tell their family members about it really could not tell about it in words. Many of them wrote about it. Some of them published articles in papers or newsletters. The most provocative things I found, though, are in letters from the veterans to their family members, either a daughter, a wife, children, grandchildren. And if anything, music and song filled the air throughout the great camp. The bands that turned out, not just the National Guard bands, but the GAR and UC bands that came and played, was really quite remarkable. Music filled the air throughout the 3 days. I know I'm running short of time. Two things I want to point out. These two veterans brought relics of their service, and what's remarkable about these men is both were able to show them and wear them. The man on the left side, see, I could go on for about 4 or 5 hours here, and I know bore the heck out of you. The man on the left side is Christian Cooley, served in Company C, 31st Virginia. He's displaying the Confederate jacket he wore home from Appomattox Courthouse. And for those of you who are familiar with the Ken Burns series, at the very end, there's a little bit of film footage. Only about 100 yards of film footage survived all the filming that was done at the 1913 reunion. And Mr. Cooley is wearing that jacket in that little bit of film footage. On the right is T.J. Dackett of the 3rd South Carolina, wearing the same hat he wore at Chickamauga, and to the top of his bullet hole. And on the front of it, he's painted a small Confederate flag with the story of the hat that he wore at Chickamauga, where he nearly lost his life. That hat today is in the Museum of the Confederacy in Richmond, Virginia. Result of the reunion, remarkably, the predictions were as high as 200 veterans would die from heat because of their age. Only 9 passed away. The last was a North Carolina soldier who dropped dead at the train station on July 5th, just before he left the great camp. The others all died of heart failure or heart attacks. But ultimately, what was allotted for the reunion, state and federal, was a budget of $450,000. It came in under budget. $415,000 and 23 cents was spent. It actually came in under budget. See if that happens today. The camp occupied 280 acres, 47.5 miles of company streets, 500 electric arc lights, 32 bubbling ice water fountains, 6,592 tents. Ultimately, the number was 54,000 plus veterans came here to Gettysburg. The only thing that was not accomplished, though, was the establishment or the laying of the cornerstone of the Eternal Light Peace Memorial. It'd be another 25 years, the 75th anniversary of the battle, before the Eternal Light Peace Memorial will come to fruition. And that was only through the generous donation of numerous states in the North and the South, donating the design as well as the materials for this monument. In memory and remembrance, though, look back at the Great Reunion. What occurred here, this was indeed not just a reunion of old veterans, but Gettysburg as a battlefield is not just a battlefield, it's also a site of national reunification. R.L. Drummond, again, one of the things that makes you sad is the fact that this grand body of men can never meet again upon this or any other earthly field. You note this in the tearful goodbye, the long clasp of the hands, the tender affectionate look at parting. It's the evening of July 4th, and the shade of night are beginning to fall over the field of Gettysburg. The monuments and statues stand out like specters in the distance. The electric lights are sparkling throughout the tented city for the last time. By tomorrow night, it'll be deserted. The silvery tones of a bugle float out over the great camp. They send a thrill to everyone who hears them. It's the bugle of the regular army sounding taps upon the field of Gettysburg. It speaks out by the authority of the government of the United States of America, of which we are all parts. When the Southern boys passed through the town on the way to the station, almost everyone with his arms linked through that of a Union veteran, it was like the passing of a victorious army with banners. Every porch, every window was filled with women from all parts of our country, waving flags and handkerchiefs, throwing kisses to the gallant old men, bidding them Godspeed on their homeward journey. As the train pulled out, the last words that one heard were, "Goodbye, Yank, and God bless you, Johnny." Very briefly, that's the story of the Great Reunion of 1913. I don't have time for questions. If you'd like to ask me something afterwards, I'll be hanging around outside. Thank you so much for coming this morning. Enjoy your visit here to the battlefield. Thank you.